This has been such a long time in the making to get Michael in the hot seat.
Years in the making.
We have
finally here.
Finally here. We have so many questions that come in all the time about ingredients and just products and getting a little bit deeper behind what you're formulating with and how you've come up with the formulation. So we have tons of questions that we want to ask you. But to start out with, vitamin A is such a staple ingredient within the industry, but there's so many different forms of vitamin A and the ways that it's working in the skin. Tell us a little bit about just the process of vitamin A.
Sure. Well, first I want to say I'm really excited to be in the studio because this is, like you said, something that we've wanted to do for a long time. It's a great atmosphere. We've had great energy here over the last several days shooting. And of course, we get tons of questions in classroom, at trade show, and in the forum. So this is a really great opportunity for us to sit and chat and address some of those things that we don't always get a lot of chance to go into great detail in. So excited to be here. Let me talk a little bit about vitamin A. So, vitamin A is something that is very near and dear to us here at Circadia. It's one of the things that I started learning about very, very early on when I first started learning about ingredient technology. And one of the reasons being is that, the story of vitamin A starts in Philadelphia. And my grandfather, being the person that he is in the industry, he went to University of Pennsylvania. And when he was a student there, many, many years ago, back in the 60s, Dr. Kligman, who is essentially credited with helping to bring vitamin A to the market as a cosmetic ingredient, was the head of dermatology there. And they ultimately became very close friends, did a lot of research together. But again, the story of how vitamin A works and how it became such a staple ingredient in our industry really begins in that area. So a fundamental knowledge and understanding of it is something that he knew very well and really helped to teach me. Years ago, it was the use of retinoic acid, of course, prescription strength, and then the introduction to other cosmetic forms like retinol, which we now recognize as the natural form, which is also the alcohol form of vitamin A. And then, of course, the introduction of ester forms to help to keep retinol itself relatively stable. It's recognized as being a little bit of an unstable type of ingredient, also relatively irritating if you use it in high concentrations. So things like retinal acetate, which is something that we use in our formulations, retinal palmitate, which has been used for a long time, retinal propionate, relatively new, retinaldehyde. So the list goes on and on and on. And there's even newer forms that are not widely used in the industry just yet that are really on the cutting edge of newer technology. But as far as how vitamin A is actually used by the skin, we can talk a little bit about that because it's extremely important. It does a lot of things for the body. So vitamin A in general assists with cellular gene differentiation. So if we look at stem cell maturation, a lot of the stem cells, how they originate, they start as bone marrow stem cells, many of them inside the body. And once they mature, once they differentiate, they become all different categories and types of cells, things like immune cells, different categories of immune cells. And vitamin A is critical to that process. And in fact, a lot of the vitamin A deficiencies that we see, medical conditions, have a lot to do with a lack of overall immune cell function. So we need to get that vitamin A in the body, in the system, in order for them to function. As it relates to skincare products and skincare formulations, topically applied, they help with things like cellular turnover, so turnover in the basal layer, cell proliferation. We also see great functionality for vitamin A in the fibroblast cells. They help to initiate different protein synthesis, things like collagen, elastin, critical proteins, structural proteins to the dermis. So it really is a hero ingredient to the industry. Definitely one of the oldest, still arguably one of the best ingredients that we have at our disposal as skincare professionals. And we could talk endlessly about vitamin A, as you know that we do in some of our classes and the details of exactly how it works.
But not all vitamin A's are created equal. So I know at Circadia we use multiple forms of vitamin A, but primarily we're using the ester form. So what is an ester and how is it more beneficial in some ways than using just a straight retinol?
Sure. I mean, that's a really good question, something important to address because, as I mentioned, retinol is the alcohol form. So whenever you see the OL at the end of the vitamin, retinol, tocopherol, which is the alcohol form of vitamin E, we know that we're dealing with that form, which again has a tendency to be relatively unstable. So ingredient manufacturers and formulators recognize this early on, and to get around that, they create ester forms. And essentially an ester is a combination of an alcohol and an organic acid. And what that does is it creates a much more stable molecule. So it's much easier to formulate with, keeps it stable inside the product, also makes it a little bit more gentle and tolerable once it's applied to the skin. So what we use primarily in the Circadia formulations currently is something called retinal acetate. When you break down an ester, you have a certain part of that molecule that is going to be the alcohol, retinol, and a certain form that's going to be the organic acid. And in the case of retinal acetate, it's acetic acid. So 89% retinol, 11% acetic acid. That makes up the entire retinal acetate molecule. So you're getting a really good percentage of that retinal acetate is still the retinol. And again, the primary purpose of using the ester is to make it more stable and more gentle for application.
And there's other forms of esters with retinol. There's some that are more sold in drugstores. Is there a different form of that ester that's less concentrated?
There's a number of different forms. The one that I think is probably most widely recognized would be retinal palmitate. It's, in my opinion, and you see the usage, it's much less. It's a bit antiquated. One of the reasons I believe is that, again, looking at the breakdown and percentage of how much of it is actually retinol, I believe it's the math, it's been a while. I think it's 48% retinol and 52% of it is palmitic acid. So if you're comparing it to the retinal acetate, it's much less of the retinol alcohol. So the benefit would be, of course, is that it's a little bit more gentle, but as far as overall activity, there's far less than you would see in another ester. And there's several others. You've got retinal propionate, which is something that was relatively newly introduced into the market years ago. There's another that's called retinal retinoate, which is really interesting because it's an ester of retinol and retinoic acid. So now you're dealing with the retinol, which is the alcohol natural form, and retinoic acid, which is the prescription strength form. So very clever for ingredient manufacturers to do that. A little bit of a teaser, we're working with a newer form of vitamin A. So we're looking at a new way to vitamin A, and that's coming up in one of our newer launches towards the end of this year.
When we're talking about all the different forms of vitamin A, there's also a lot of different vitamin A alternatives because, as you mentioned, sometimes vitamin A can be a little bit oversensitizing for specific skin types. Mm-hmm. I know we have a couple of different vitamin A alternatives that we're using, but what are the fan favorites of yours that you formulated into the product?
Right, well, and that's a really interesting point to bring up as well because, again, everybody assimilates vitamin A differently, and there is a fair amount of the population that just cannot tolerate the higher concentrations of vitamin A and certainly vitamin A at all in general. So bakuchiol is one that we're using in the pumpkin perfecting mask, which is amazing because it's been around for a while and only up until recently, maybe in the last few years, did it kind of skyrocket and get the visibility that it has now. I had it on the shelf in our lab for a number of years, and once I started really seeing it out there, I thought, well, maybe I should try and put this into a product. And of course, I was very impressed with the results, and I started to dig into exactly how it works. So you have a lot of the same biomarkers as far as cell differentiation, morphogenesis, gene transcription when it comes to what we want to get out of an effective vitamin A product. And that's exactly what the bakuchiol is doing without some of the irritation that's associated with vitamin A. Because again, as good as vitamin A is, if you're using even mid to high level concentrations, you can see flaking in client skin, you can see redness, you can sometimes see purging or breaking out because it's a cell proliferator. The basal layer goes all the way down under the hair bulb, so some of that cell desquamation that starts when you first using it, those cells are going to desquamate inside the follicle, so it creates a little bit of additional congestion. So what a lot of clients notice is that they have a bit more of an acne-prone skin and they start using vitamin A, it has a tendency to get a little bit worse before it starts to get better. So a lot of that is avoided, and we can circumvent that by using bakuchiol and some of the other vitamin A alternatives. Mm-hmm.
And speaking of some of that irritation that happens, I know that with Circadia we have a wonderful step-up program where we have multiple percentages of vitamin A. What makes our step-up program so great, and why would we want to start somebody on the lower end? Because we're in an industry where everyone thinks the more the better.
Yes.
But how come not always the case, and how come you formulated multiple products with vitamin A?
Yeah, and again, that's something that was recognized very early on, and something that my grandfather really helped to instill into the education of professionals around the world early on, even long before Circadia was a brand, is that the skin has to acclimate to those higher levels of vitamin A. And being the skin physiologist that he was, he understood that very well. So it's in order to be able to not see the flaking and the purging and the redness that you can sometimes experience. So we'll start with lower concentrations and ultimately build up. We really helped to pioneer that in the industry. So a 0.3% is where we start with our nighttime repair. A 0.5% is what we bump up to in the Nighttime Repair Plus. Then we also have two other options, our vitamin A boosting cream and the vitamin A gel. The boosting cream utilizes the same ester that's in the Nighttime Repair and the Plus, the retinal acetate. And then the vitamin A gel is the full 1% retinol. So kind of two different applications as far as the clientele, those that do need and require the additional proliferative effect that vitamin A provides should be more inclined to use the vitamin A gel. Those that don't need quite as much proliferative effect but still need the additional boost will do much better with a vitamin A boosting cream. But starting with the low concentrations, ultimately building up to the higher levels, it's a really good way to start getting used to vitamin A. And again, it's a great tool. And one of the key signs of aging is a lack of cell turnover. That's vitamin A's primary function. So as we start to see those cumulative signs of damage, cellular buildup, darker hyperpigmented lesions at the surface of the skin in early to mid 30s, that's a really good time to start to introduce those lower level vitamin A's and then start to build up.
I feel like some of the younger generation is really embracing the whole concept of self-care and starting to use professional skincare at a younger age. But being that vitamin A really helps to increase cell turnover, when would be the optimal time to start to introduce it? If you introduce it too early, is it going to be detrimental to the skin? What's your advice there?
Sure. And that's a really interesting point to make as well, is that up until 30s, cells are turning over at a relatively rapid rate. And if you look at young adults and teenagers, that cell turnover cycle from basal cell, mother cell dividing, becoming daughter cells, and that journey that they make through the different layers, spiny layer, granular layer, stratum corneum, before they ultimately slough off. That's 10, 15 days at the most until the cumulative signs of aging, everything from oxidative stress and pollution and other environmental factors, ultraviolet radiation, glycation. That's when we start to see those cell turnover cycles lengthen to anywhere from 30, 35, upwards of 40 days. So that age range, it depends on what type of damage has been accumulated in that client, right? So it can start to show up as early as the late 20s. Usually it's 30s, right? Mid 30s into the 40s, depends on how the client's taking care of themselves. So I would generally say in the 30s is when most guests start to see the biggest change in their skin and when they should actually start to seek out the vitamin A at those mid to low levels.
Circadia was founded on the concept of circadian rhythms, yes, protecting and repairing. So when you're utilizing vitamin A in a formula or in a regimen, are there any sun sensitizing portions of the vitamin A that you should only be applying them at certain times of the day?
That's really important to note because vitamin A is a cell proliferator. It actually helps to accelerate cell turnover. So when we look at circadian rhythms and the tie-in there, one of the things that we recognize about circadian rhythms is that in the evening is when the skin and the cells are engaging in the most cell turnover. In fact, there's about 30 times more cell turnover at night than there is during the day. That's something that's hardwired into our physiology because if that was something that was taking place during the day, the DNA is unraveling during that process. So if the DNA is unraveling and uncoiling itself, it leaves it much more prone to environmental stress. And in particular, ultraviolet radiation, UVB, can radiate those DNA structures and create cross-linking, right? Cross-linking creates dimers. Dimers can lead to mutations. Mutations ultimately lead to skin cancer. So the body inherently know, hey, this is a process that we want to do during the evening time. So it's very important to utilize cell proliferators at night to help assist with those natural circadian rhythm processes. So almost always you'll see skincare brands, manufacturers recommending nighttime because again, the vitamin A helps with that natural mechanism of cell turnover.
I think there's also a lot of misconception about vitamin A and utilizing it during pregnancy and also when a woman is nursing. I know we really err on the side of caution, but why would that be a contraindication for vitamin A products?
Sure. I mean, it's still a debate because, again, it's a cell proliferator, and of course, there is a certain amount of vitamin A that will absorb into the bloodstream. That started a long time ago, again, back with Dr. Kligman, and when they were using retinoic acid, they were actually testing it on pigmentation, in particular on the line of demarcation that happens on women's stomachs when they're pregnant. You see that pigmentation line. And it was developing these tetragenic growths. And tetragenesis means little monster. So you'll see these like odd growths that were coming from this proliferative effect that the vitamin A was having. So that's when the recommendation to not use vitamin A categorically across the board happened. Now, you still need to err on the side of caution, no high concentration, especially if you're looking at how much supplementation, if you're taking supplements orally, are being used, but very rare that there would be an issue with the use of a cosmetic grade vitamin A in the levels that we're talking about that could affect fetal development.